Hello and welcome back. In this lecture we'll start writing our Reddit app. We'll see how to create an AngularJS controller and how to make HTTP requests so we can get the JSON data from reddit.com. So let's start by creating the new project. We've seen how this works before. We need to open up a terminal, go into the folder where we want to create our project and type Ionic start, the name of the project that I'm going to call my Reddit, and a template. I'll use the blank template, that's the simplest one, because we only need a single view for this app. We don't need tabs or navigation or anything like that. As soon as the project has been created, we can start our app in development mode by going into the new project folder and typing Ionic serve. This starts up the app in our new browser tab. And I'll resize this window so we can see the app running side by side with a text editor. And I'll open up Sublime Text with our new project. So projects, my Reddit. And the first file we want to look at is index.html in the www folder. This is the main page for our application. I'll quickly remove all these comments to reduce the noise on the screen, and we can start by changing this title from blank starter to something more appropriate to our app like my Reddit. And as soon as I save this, you can see that it's immediately visible in the running app thanks to live reload. Next, we want to look at some JavaScript code. You can see that this page includes app.js, so let's open up that file. There's some code here that was generated by the Ionic start command, and again I'll just delete all the comments to reduce the noise. And we can see that it's using Angular, and we've mentioned that Ionic is based on AngularJS, so our app is essentially an Angular module. What this is doing is creating a new module called starter that depends on Ionic, and then calls the run function on the module. We could make this more explicit by introducing a new variable called app and calling the run function on the app object like this. The downside of this is that now this app variable is in the global namespace, and that's not a good practice. So we could wrap everything in an anonymous function like this and then call this function immediately, so this code gets executed but in its own function, and this app variable will only be visible in this scope. Next, I'd like to change the name of the module from starter to something more specific to our app, like my Reddit. But if we save this, you can see that something breaks in the running app, and that's because we need to make the same change on the HTML side. You can see that there's an ng-app attribute on the body tag set to starter. So if we replace this to my Reddit, which is a new name, everything works again. So this ng-app directive is what tells AngularJS what code to run on this page. The next thing we want to do is create a new controller. If you're not familiar with Angular, the controller is basically the place where we set up the data that we want to display in the view, that is the HTML. So to create a controller, we call the controller function on the app object and we pass a controller name. I'll call this Reddit controller, and then the function with the controller code. And most of the time we want to use the scope service. Angular does what's called dependency injection. That means that whenever we need a service, like the scope service in this case, we just need to declare it as a parameter to our controller function, and Angular will inject it, that is, pass it to us automatically. So this scope service allows us to share variables between the controller and the view. We can add variables to this scope. For example, we're going to need a stories variable that contains a list of the stories that we want to display in the page. So we can create a stories variable on the scope that is an array. And let's say that each story will be an object with a title. I'll just create some test data for now. Let's call this the first story, and then there will be a second story with a different title. And in reality, there will be more fields, of course, rather than just the title, but let's see how this works. Now that we have this stories variable, we can use it in the view. First of all, we need to declare this new controller by using the ng-controller directive. And since we have a single controller, I'll add this to the body tag, so we can use our new controller everywhere inside the body tag. Now that we've defined our new controller, we can access the variables we defined on its scope, for it, like the stories variable. So if I say show the stories like this will display the content of the stories variable. So this syntax with double curly braces is called mustache, and it tells Angular to evaluate the content as an expression. And you can see that it's printing out the content of the stories variable. And since that's an array, what we're seeing is actually its JSON representation. That's not what we want to show to our users, of course. What we want to show is the title of each story. So we can access that with, for example, let's take the first story and then call title on that one. So we can see that it's now printing out the first story title. And we can repeat the same exercise for the second one and maybe wrap each story in its own div so they will show on separate rows. But of course, we don't want to manually add a new element for each item in the array. We want some way to automatically generate all the divs for each element in the array. And we can do that by using the ng-repeat directive provided by Angular. So we can say repeat for each story in the stories variable, which means that we can use this story variable now. So the title will be story.title, and you can see that the result is the same, but we don't need to explicitly declare each item manually. And if we change our data on the controller, for example, we add a third object, let's call this the third story, then the HTML updates automatically. So this is a simple example of how to add a variable on the scope and to use it in the view. But what we really want to do is go and fetch some data from reddit.com. So let's go to the Reddit website, and let's say that we want to show the Android subreddit. So we go to new so we can see the most recent posts. And we've seen that if we just append .json, we get the data in JSON format. So this is the URL we want to call. And if we go back to our app, to make HTTP requests, we need to use the HTTP service provided by Angular. And like for the scope service, we only need to declare it as a parameter to our function, and it will be passed automatically by AngularJS. So what we want to do is initialize our stories to be an empty array, and then we can call HTTP GET, passing the URL that we want to download, and on success we execute this function that will receive the response data. And to start with, we can just log the response to the console so we can see what it looks like. Now if I open up the Chrome Developer Tools, we should see that it has logged the response object. There it is. And this object contains a data object that contains an array of children. And each child item has another data object that finally contains all the fields we're interested in, like the title and thumbnail and URL and so on. So this is the object that we want to reach for each story that we want to display. So to do that, we want to go to response.data.children, and this is an array, so we can iterate over the array. There's a nice function provided by Angular called forEach that takes the array and then a function that receives the items. So this will be a child. So for each child, we want to, let's start by displaying the child.data. That should be the object with all the fields, right? So we can see that it's printing an object for each item, and this object has all the fields that we want. So that's the right object. So we can add this child data to our stories array. So rather than logging it, let's just add it to scope.stories. Let's push it onto the array. If we do this, you can see that our view immediately updates and shows all the real titles that we get from reddit.com, because this is calling story.title, and the objects we get from Reddit have a title attribute, so this works. Not only that, but we can now use all the other fields that we get. For example, we could display story.domain that shows where the link goes to, and we could turn this title into a link. So if we wrap it in an A tag, then we can say that we want to go to story.url and maybe open this in a new tab by setting target to blank. If we do this, you can see that this is now clickable, and if we open this, we go to the article linked by this story. So everything is working as expected. You'll see we're now getting real data in JSON format from reddit.com. And we've created our controller and we're making our HTTP request. So this is the end of this lecture. In the next lecture, we'll make this page look a lot nicer by using the Ionic list component. See you later.